What are you thinking? How do you feel?
This is my boomstick!
It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie.
The visions of an industrial hellscape ruled by authoritarian governments came to director and writer Richard Stanley based on his real-life experience of living in South Africa during the Cold War, a violent time in world history where two superpowers fought proxy wars in third world countries, all while the rest of the world waited with bated breath for a nuclear catastrophe that could cause the world as they once knew it to crumble around them. 1990s Hardware holds a mirror to American culture and asks, what would happen if the first world started acting like the third world? Hardware also grew out of Stanley's Super 8 film titled Incidents in an Expanding Universe that shared a similar sci-fi tone, but celebrating looking toward the future, where Hardware is a bleak reminiscing of the past. Just a few years after creating his Super 8, many people who worked on it were either killed or traumatized in the Angolan Bush War. Richard Stanley fled to England to avoid the South African military and military police. Now in England as an illegal immigrant, Stanley purchased a ticket to an all-day and all-night showing of Dario Argento movies at the Scala Cinema. Originally, he bought the ticket for shelter and a place to sleep, but Stanley was captivated by the 8 Argento movies shown that day. Stanley has said it is impossible to find the words to describe the first 10 minutes of Suspiria on the big screen. The vibrant colours in Hardware are without a doubt a nod to the filmography of Argento that inspired Stanley that day. After a brief stint directing music videos in England, Richard Stanley travelled to Afghanistan to document the withdrawal of Russian troops at the end of the Soviet-Afghan War. The withdrawal caused a power vacuum that slid the country into civil war and eventually resulted in the rise of the Taliban, providing further material for Stanley to base Hardware off of. The Mark 13 android that hunts the protagonists of Hardware was said to be based off the Italian slashers of the time, replacing the human killer with an android. Stanley wanted to distance himself from killer robot films of the decade like Terminator by having his android be fully robotic rather than appearing as humanoid. The Mark 13 name originally had no thought behind the name, besides being an unlucky number. However, actor Dylan McDermott referenced Mark 13:20 in the Bible, which held a quote that summarised the story of Hardware perfectly.
No flesh shall be spared, save that of the elect.
Both his droid design and the Desert Scavenger came from nightmares Richard experienced and had sketched. The toxin-releasing syringes act as fangs for the droid, and eliminated from the original theatrical release was a scene featuring the power drill phallus on the Mark 13. The droid is realised as a horrible mass of pistons and motors. Depicted on the soulless android skull are the stars and stripes, perhaps an allegory for America at the time. A brutal war machine that does not know when it is committing evil, as it just follows its orders. The environments of the Hardware Earth were also birthed from the fears of Stanley's nuclear nightmares. The clouds of nuclear winter block out the sun and rain is scarce. The temperatures of the atmosphere rise, creating an infernal hot house effect. There is no lush greenery or wildlife, only deserts that wait to be discovered. The cities are polluted, cramped, and decorated with CCTV cameras. Civil liberties have eroded, and there are no signs of resistance. CCTV watch your every move, and the people have accepted it. The only concern of the citizens is surviving any way they can. An ongoing theme throughout the movie is sterilisation. The TVs and radios advertise and celebrate sterilisation,
for the proposed emergency population control bill,
branding it a generational pause in breeding. Another scene cut by the studios was during the sex scene with Mo and Jill. Jill is so disinterested in what's going on, she starts watching a Holocaust documentary on the TV. A symbolic scene that relates the idea of complicity, eugenics, and population control between our real world and the post-apocalyptic world of Hardware. The sprawling crimson desert, the industrial mega-buildings, and grimy concrete streets. Richard Stanley created an entire world with a budget less than $1 million. The crew consisted of underage kids to help with the on-set labor, and graphics were made on a high school computer. Most of the movie was shot in a former railway centre that was available. The space provided sufficient space for filming, trailers, and building the props for the movie. The streets are dirty and lived in. The TVs never broadcast peaceful programming. Instead, they show messages from the government and heavy metal. At times, the story and action can feel clunky and inefficient. One has to wonder if this is a deliberate reflection of the world of hardware, clunky, obtuse, big and messy. Production only left one time to Morocco to get their shots of the desert. Of course, the crew landed in Morocco and were greeted by torrential downpours. The streets were flooded and the locals reportedly said it hadn't rained there in 55 years. Richard Stanley, ever opportunistic, used his short career in the music video industry to include Iggy Pop and Lemmy as cameos. The film itself was scored by Simon Boswell, who Stanley discovered by Simon's work on Argento movies like Phenomena. Guitars twang and riff transporting the audience to a poor and simple area of the southern United States. Simon's sublime score gives the entire film a doomy and discordant feeling. The typical action scenes are given a slow and angelic feeling, and ultimately the music climaxes while Mo experiences a hallucinogenic head trip brought on by a dose of lethal toxins. It is only once we see Mo faced with death that we finally witness ecstasy and euphoria. Is this film an artistic passion project of Richard Stanley, or is it a dire warning to humanity about authoritarian government, a crisis of overpopulation, climate change and nuclear fallout? Only time will tell. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to get notified when the next love letter to a cinema classic drops. Check out Dread and Terror on Instagram, Twitter and Patreon to show support. We love you all so much. It's scary.